the different various aspects of the treaty that ended World War One, and that's the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, and if you look at it, it looks like Versailles. It's Versailles. It's French. Okay, the name comes from like in the year 1690. The King Louis moved the capital of his monarchy from Paris to this palace he had built. And there's an enormous palace there called the Palace of Versailles, and I've actually been there. It's pretty beautiful, and it's enormous. Um, anyway, that's where the treaty was held, and that's why it's called the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so we were talking about the various aspects of it. Things like new countries are going to be created. A lot of that had to do with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, but ultimately, Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points were largely unsuccessful, and that's a result of the opposition that he faced, and that the Treaty of Versailles faced from the other Allied victors. Okay, so you have Georges Clemenceau of France, and you have David Lloyd George of Great Britain. And, these are the leaders of the countries who had, been a lot of their country was destroyed as a result of World War One, and they wanted to see Germany pay for it. And that's where you see the reparations aspect, where Germany had to pay England and France for the damages done to their nations during the war. And then also the Treaty of Versailles had the humiliating war guilt clause. Does anybody remember what the war guilt clause says?
That Germany will take all the blame.
That's right. Germany is 100% responsible for the death of every man, woman, and child, for everything that happened during World War One. They are solely responsible. They had to admit it. So, and there are other aspects of the Treaty of Versailles as well. Germany is no longer allowed to have a military. The reparations they have to pay to the Allies, billions of dollars, which they don't have. And ultimately, what do you think about this political cartoon? What are we saying here? What is the cartoonist saying? All right. Well, what's the words going on? Can you read it at least?
Reparations.
Okay, reparations, and he's adding a P to it, turning the word into preparations.
Preparation for the Second World War.
Hey, reparations leads to World War II, because all the parts of the crumbling Treaty of Versailles that doesn't work, it's unsuccessful, directly lead to the Germans, that's this guy, you can tell by his helmet, getting ready for World War II. Okay? So, in essence, the treaty, World War II begins with a peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so, how does Woodrow Wilson feel about every aspect of the Treaty of Versailles? Does it go hand in hand with his 14 points? Not even close, okay? But he signed, he was there, and so it's part of it's his baby, along with the British and the French. So when Woodrow Wilson returned to the United States, a lot of Americans were unhappy about the Treaty of Versailles. Many people, included like Herbert Hoover, he believed it was too harsh, and that the economic consequences would put down all of Europe and thus injure the United States. And he was right. The reparations were not a good thing for the global interconnected economy. Others considered the treaty a sellout to imperialism. You just caved in to what those British and French empires wanted. It's a sellout. You're just exchanging one colonial ruler for another. Other people didn't like the way the boundaries were drawn. They don't think it satisfied the demands of, for the longest time, the Polish people had been under German rule, and now German people were under Polish rule. It's kind of bad. It should have been totally delineated into a new country. So the main object of opposition, however, was the League of Nations, which was Woodrow Wilson's idea. Who can tell me what the League of Nations was and what was it intended to be?
When there is a conflict between places, they talk about it.
That's right. It is a worldwide organization that any country can be a member of, and you can discuss your problems in the public, open and transparent, and the entire purpose of it is to avoid what? War, death, destruction. A lot of Americans want no part of the League of Nations. Why? It has to do with an I word, which has been a part of American foreign policy since the days of George Washington. Isolationism. We don't want to be a part of this. So you get that old faction, the people still trying to grab on to isolationism. And then you have people like Teddy Roosevelt, the progressives. We're the best. We need to show everybody we're the best. Okay? So, but the main opponent of us joining the League of Nations was a man by the name of Henry Cabot Lodge. And he is a conservative senator. Conservatives very much like to keep the way things always have been. They're very traditionalists. And Henry Cabot Lodge was particularly suspicious of the League of Nations, especially the provisions about joint economic and military action against aggressors. So, like if somebody does invade another country, then we all chip in to help out, go put them down. So it's everybody against one person. And so he feels like he's having American autonomy taken away because no longer is it Congress's ability to declare war. It would be the League of Nations declaring war. But this is Woodrow Wilson's thing, This is Woodrow Wilson's. So Woodrow Wilson ignores them. And he begins to travel all across the nation to tell the United States people of the United States, that the League of Nations is a good thing that we should be a part of. And you should contact your senator to approve it, to approve America joining. Just because Woodrow Wilson signed the Treaty of Versailles, that doesn't mean that America approves of every aspect of it. Yeah, the president can sign treaties, but guess, we have checks and balances in our country. Who approves treaties? Congress, the Senate. They have to approve everything the president signs. So just because he signed doesn't mean it immediately happens. He has to convince the Senate and the American people that the League of Nations is something that we should be a part of. So he goes on an 8,000-mile tour of the United States, delivering about 34 speeches in 3 weeks, explaining why the United States should join the League of Nations, something that he invented. It was his idea. While on tour, he suffers a stroke. A blood vessel in his brain ruptured, which partially paralyzed him for more than 2 months. So he had a once powerful voice, but now he could just barely whisper. And he's still president. It was largely kept secret, and his wife did a lot of the presidenting, believe it or not. Like she kind of filled in because he wasn't incapacitated. Like he wasn't completely out of it, but he also wasn't really capable of standing up and delivering a speech. So he's still the president. So it's not like the vice president took over. But eventually he dies in his sleep. So when the treaty comes up to a vote in the Senate in November of 1919, and it fails. The United States never joins the League of Nations. An American idea. So we finally sign a treaty with Germany in 1921 while Woodrow Wilson's no longer president. But the United States never joined the League of Nations. But it did maintain an unofficial observer at all League of Nations meetings. So. Woodrow Wilson was not president when he passed away. Okay, he did not die in office. Can you guys name all the presidents who died in office? Who's the first one? It's cold. Should have wore a hat. Abraham Lincoln's not the first one to die in office. He did die in office, though. William Henry Harrison. How'd he die? Remember, he got pneumonia. He gave his inauguration speech in a cold, wintry day in Washington, got pneumonia and died a month into his presidency. Anybody else? Who's the next one? Zachary Taylor dies of really like diarrhea, gastroenteritis, stomach flu. Millard Fillmore replaced him. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, replaced by Andrew Johnson. Who's the next? Who else died in office? James Garfield. What happened to him? He was assassinated. William McKinley. What happened to him? Also assassinated. The bullet's not really what killed him. Gangrene kills him. Infection from the bullet. About a month later. Gross. Guy we haven't talked about yet, Warren G. Harding. He dies in office. He has a heart attack. FDR has a cerebral hemorrhage, and then finally, JFK is assassinated on office. So that's like 8 presidents that died in office. That's probably didn't realize that it's been that many, but there has been. Okay. So where are we at now? Okay, so we are in the post-war world. Post-war world. World War I had left much of the American people exhausted. And then after the war, the debate over the League of Nations deeply divided the United States of America. Further, the progressive movement had caused numerous changes in American life. The economy also was in a great change, great state of adjustment. Soldiers, the 3 million soldiers that we sent over to war began returning home. And these returning soldiers faced unemployment or took their old jobs away from women and minorities that filled them while they were gone. The cost of living in the United States had doubled. Farmers and factory workers suffered as wartime orders were diminishing. And many Americans responded to stressful conditions by becoming fearful of outsiders. Fear is an odd thing, folks. Being afraid can lead people to do pretty horrendous things. I would make the argument that being frightened is more dangerous than fear itself. Because being frightened can make people do things that are irrational. And that is one of the things that happens after World War I. Okay? A lot of Americans responded by becoming fearful of outsiders. And this is not a new idea. It's called nativism or prejudice against foreign born people. It sweeps the nation. Sweeps the nation. For no apparent reason. People were just fearful. So, this goes to increase isolationism. Stay away. Don't come to our country. We want to be isolated. We want to pull away from the involvement in world affairs after World War I. But can we? We're the most powerful nation in the world after World War I. How can we pull out? So after World War I, one of the greatest perceived threats was communism. Communism. Can anybody give me a definition of communism?
It's like, I don't know if this is going to make sense.
Okay.
It's a type of government.
It is.
And instead of like everyone having to go out and earn their own, it's like a community. And so they all share like the same money and the same food.
That's really good definition. That's really good. You're not wrong. You're absolutely right. I'm going to expand on what you're saying because you're right. It is a type of government, but it's not just a government. It's also an economic system, okay? In America, we have democracy and we also have capitalism. They're separate. In communism, everything is together. It's government and the economy are completely linked, all right? So it's an economic and political system. And the greatest characteristic of communism is government ownership of property. Government ownership of property. So a centrally owned economy. Factories and homes and resources, factors of production, all owned by the government. There's only one political party in a community, and you kind of worship the party. That's kind of how communism works. So it's based on single-party government ruled by a dictator. So there's one party, and it's ruled by one person. These are aspects of communism. So part of the fear that Americans had is that communists would put an end to private property. Meaning no more businesses. You don't own a business. The government owns it. So the government will own everything. Factories, railroads, everything. And this fear of communism grows into a panic. And that panic we refer to now as the Red Scare. The Red Scare. Now, this panic began in 1919 after revolutionaries in Russia overthrew the Tsar Nicholas, the last Tsar in Russia. I showed you a picture of him last week. Once he goes away, they have elections and they choose communism. The person in charge of the revolution was Vladimir Lenin. Lenin, not like John Lennon. Vladimir Ilyanov Lenin, V.I. Lenin. Followers of Lenin are called Bolsheviks. 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 Sounds like a bad word. Bolshevik. Bolshevism, or the Bolsheviks, simply means the majority. That's what it means. That's what it translates into. And Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks established a new communist country in Russia. And they cried out for a worldwide revolution that would end capitalism everywhere. So what's so wrong with capitalism?
It's a little bit greedy.
Greed and the disparity between rich and poor. You can have on the same neighborhood street somebody who's a gajillionaire and other people digging in a dumpster for a peach pit. So there's a great disparity between rich and poor in capitalism. Communism, Lenin would argue that everybody is treated the same. There would be no poverty, zero poverty, because all the resources are strictly controlled by the government, and everybody's the same. Okay? So a communist party did form in the United States, and 70,000 people joined it. Many of them came from the labor union, the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. And these people are pretty radical. They're a little radical. Well, they're a lot radical. Because many of them are not just simply communists. They want to see the entire government burn. They're anarchists. All right? And when several dozen bombs were mailed to government and business leaders, the United States public grew fearful that communism was trying to take over. So, in an effort to root out communism in the United States, the U.S. Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, took action against the communists to combat the Red Scare. And so, in August of 1919, Palmer appointed a very young man to be his special assistant. And that young man's name is J. Edgar Hoover. You ever heard of his name before? Very important American for the next, 50 years. One of the most powerful men in the world. J. Edgar Hoover. Palmer, Hoover, and many of their agents hunted down suspected communists, socialists, and anarchists. Really people who opposed any form of government. In doing so, it was almost Gestapo-esque. Like, they did some pretty heavy-handed stuff. Trampled on people's civil rights, invaded private homes and offices, putting people in jail without legal counsel. Hundreds of foreign-born people were deported without trials. Just, we think you're a communist, you're gone. No due process of law. The Bill of Rights, they just kind of threw it away during this, what is now known as the Palmer Raids. Palmer Raids. And all the while, the Palmer Raids failed to turn up evidence of a big communist conspiracy. It just didn't exist. Yes, there were some people that considered themselves communists. Was there a conspiracy to try to overthrow the government and replace it with a dictatorship? No. It did not exist. They didn't even find any explosives. And they were doing some pretty illegal stuff to try to find it. So the Red Scare was pretty well short-lived, but it doesn't go away. In the 1950s, it comes right back after World War II. So the Red Scare fed people's suspicions of foreigners and immigrants. Anytime bad things start to go bad in America, we like to blame somebody. Historically, we like to blame somebody. Typically, it's immigrants. I can't find a job. Let's blame the immigrants. All crime is up. Let's blame the immigrants. Really, Americans need to look in the mirror. So, this nativist attitude led to ruined reputations, wrecked lives, a trampling on the Bill of Rights. But it did make a name for J. Edgar Hoover, who eventually becomes the director of a new branch of the United States government called the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. You ever heard of it? He's the first director of it, and he builds it from the ground up, from a police force of 12 people to what it is today in his lifetime. And he's an interesting character himself. You can do discovery on your own of his private life activities. From what I understand, he liked to wear ladies' clothing. But hey, to each his own. Okay, so during this wave of nativist sentiment, a prevailing attitude swept the nation almost into a chant called "Keep America for Americans." Keep America for Americans. And anti-immigrant attitudes have been growing ever since the days of the Irish in the 1840s. And again, many of these immigrants were willing to work for low wages in industries such as coal mining, steel production, textiles. But after the war ends, the need for unskilled labor in the United States decreased. Goes down. So nativists believe that because the United States now had fewer unskilled jobs available, fewer immigrants should be let in the country. Especially since many of these people they believe to be anarchists and socialists and communists and the troublemakers, not good, wholesome, white-faced Protestant Americans. So racist ideas begin to spread throughout the United States. And you see an organization which formed in the years immediately after the Civil War become wildly popular. The Ku Klux Klan. This is them having a rally in front of the United States Capitol and a parade where people would bring their children to watch them march. Less than 100 years ago. People that you know probably were alive at this time. So, as a result of the Red Scare and anti-immigrant feelings, different groups of bigots and used anti-communism as an excuse to harass any group that was dislike themselves. You guys know what a bigot is? B-I-G-O-T? Bigot. It's a person who is intolerant of any creed, race, religion, or political belief that's not their own. And that is a very good definition of a Klansman. Because really, it's not what the Klan is for, it's what they're against. Because the list of what they're against is very long. The list of what they stand for is very short. So the Klan was devoted to what they called 100% Americanism. And by 1924, membership in the KKK reached 4.5 million people. 4.5 million people were card-carrying proud members of the KKK. White, male persons, native born. Obviously, their beliefs include things like what they would say keeping blacks in their place. I don't know what place that is. But they opposed unions. They wanted to make Catholics, Jews, and foreign people leave the country. And KKK members were paid to recruit new members into their world of secret racial violence. The KKK even began to dominate the politics of several states, having leaders be governors and senators and House of Representatives and House of Delegates members within most states. So, politically, you begin to see some new laws form that adhere to some of the ideas of the KKK, like the quota system. Now, we call it the quota system because it's a set of laws, several laws. From 1919 to 1921, the years immediately after World War I, immigration had grown 600%. But after 1921, with the beginning of quotas, you guys know what a quota is? A quota is like a set of limits on how many, in this instance, how many immigrants from various countries a nation will admit every year. So, it depended upon what country you're immigrating from as to whether, how many people we would let. So, if you are an Italian, that number is very low. If you're British, hey, you come on as many as you want. So, depending upon the country you're from, how dark your skin was, what God you prayed to, that determined the level of immigration from that country. How racist is this? This is racist, period. Okay? So, this system established the maximum number of people who could enter the United States from each foreign country on earth. So, literally, a bunch of white dudes sat in a room and started naming off countries and be like, okay, I don't like them, I hate them, here's why I don't like them, and listed all their racist thoughts about every country. We got a long way to go. But this provision discriminated mostly against people from Eastern and Southern Europe, because these were the people that were coming to America that were Catholic and Jews. The law also prohibited Japanese immigration, which caused a lot of ill will between the United States and Japan, which had previously pretty good relations since the days of Teddy Roosevelt, who helped to mediate the Russo-Japanese War. But this quota, the Emergency Quota Act and Immigration Act, these things go a long way to cause divisions between the United States and lots of foreign countries. And you know what conservatives say? That's okay. We don't need them because we are isolationists. Stay away. Keep out of our business. And that's a good place to stop.